Hello, Matt Williamson back here from Pop Goes the 60s. And today I have with me a special guest, Ethan Alexanian. And Ethan runs the podcast Fans on the Run. Thanks for joining me, Ethan.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
So tell us a little bit about Fans on the Run. It's a Beatles-centric podcast, one of the 5 or 6 that are out there.
5 or 6. I think that's
6,000, huh?
Yeah, that sounds more accurate. It's a very saturated field. But the show is basically it's about the fans. I bring on a fan and we explore their personal history of Beatle fandom, how they first got into the Beatles, what the Beatles mean to them, etc., etc. And I've done, I think, 75 episodes so far.
Yeah, and I guess the latest one you had was somebody pretty someone people will know. Why don't you tell us about that one?
Well, actually, two that are the one you're referring to is I had this little known author on my show named Mark Lewison, and we had a nice chat for about an hour about how he got into the Beatles, all that stuff, and by the time this conversation between Matt and I is up, a new episode will have just gone up with Dave Gregory, formerly of XTC.
Very cool.
And his personal, Beatle fandom.
Yeah, so Ethan was kind enough to ask me on his podcast, so I'm finally returning the favor here. And one of the things we're going to talk about today are record labels, logos, and LP design. And the reason we're going to talk about this is because he and I have some things in common. We're both designers. We both have a background in fine art. And I thought it'd be kind of a cool topic to talk about some of the designs that I grew up with, and now Ethan is getting into quite a bit. And the 60s have a lot more to offer than just the music. The designs are pretty darn cool as well. So I actually started listening to 45s as a real little kid. I was about 2 or 3. Ethan, what did you start listening to? Are you a CD guy?
Yeah, my introduction to music was pretty much CDs. And, even the CDs had their own little charms. Like, I still remember as a kid, being kind of ooh and ahhing over the old CDs with just the reflective and then the black text. And it's like, wow, this is ancient. Little did I know.
Yeah, so we've had some format changes since then, and I don't know where it's going to next. I think it'll just be maybe implanted in our chip in our brain or something, provided we keep up our subscription. But yeah, so let's dive into some of the early 45s. I'm going to start with a couple favorites of mine. So when I started really listening to music, I moved to the place I grew up in. My neighbor Dan, who was my age, he had 7 older brothers and sisters with a lot of records laying around. So we had tons to listen to, and I couldn't read. So you kind of had to poke around and figure out why I liked this one, and you had to remember the label. So one of my first labels that I fell in love with was Roy Orbison. I had Pretty Woman, and this was my mom had this single, and this early label was one I just for some reason looked really pleasing to me. And after a couple of years, this broke, or I forget what happened. And I told my dad, I said, this is one of my favorite songs. And I'll get you a new one. So he got me a new one. And this is that new one. It's a different label. I said, Dad, this isn't it. He said, yeah, it is. But I didn't realize it was a newer label. So this is from like maybe 1972. And
heartbreaking.
I was heartbroken, but I played it because this is worn out. So that was my first label experience.
So I didn't really grow up with 45s. And when I got to the time where I was buying and listening to records, I was mainly an LP guy. So 45s were a bit of a novelty. But I don't know what's come over me in the last few years. There's just something alluring about, maybe a band that you don't like everything on an album from. So you just get the 45. And I've fallen in love with, as Matt has, the labels. And one of my favorites as of late is the Marmalade label.
Ah, yeah.
So this is This Wheels on Fire by Julie Driscoll, Brian Auger, and the Trinity.
Yeah, I think they were the first British band to cover that song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great song.
Mhm.
And it was one of my best experiences at a record store because I went in determined to find a copy of This Wheels on Fire, and I found This Wheels on Fire.
Wow, very cool. So that's what I would consider one of the psychedelic labels they were starting to come out in the later 60s.
What's the name of the Yardbirds manager again?
𝗘𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗀.
This was 𝗘𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗰𝗀𝗀𝗀's label.
Okay. Oh, was it? Okay, didn't know that. That's cool. Well, my turn to show one now.
Okay.
Another monument. I just showed you this one here from the 70s. Another early one. This was also my mom. She was a Roy Orbison fan. This is an early Monument album or single. And this is Only the Lonely. So this is one of my favorites as well. And what I used to do, because I couldn't read, is I might draw something on one side of the label so I would know what side is which. So that's how I was able to always put the correct side that I wanted to play.
So you were in a way like a radio DJ.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. Plug this side.
Plug this side. Yeah. And I found that if I go through my records, I got a couple stacks here. I for some reason liked the B-sides. I wasn't listening to the hits. I was listening to the B-sides almost across the board, which is a little odd. I didn't know what a hit was. I didn't listen to radio at that age.
I don't have it on hand. Just talking about writing on 45 labels. I have a promo copy of Donovan's Atlantis.
Oh, wow.
It's a double-sided, Rush release, epic, same song on both sides. And someone wrote on the label, probably some station director, "Garbage!" ! Like, well, it comes with liner notes.
I could do a whole video on what's been written on my album jackets and on the labels, and just people's names basically, which is a lot of fun because all these people that did write their names on their albums over 50 years ago, they're still around, and you can say, Joe Barnes, I got your album here.
Yeah. So, remember that copy of In the Hollies style that you gave up when you were throwing out all your records?
There you go.
I have it now.
Yeah, I'm sure some records have gotten into back into somebody's hands. I just was listening on the radio that happened to a local DJ here who does an oldies station, like oldies meaning big band, and went to an estate sale to find his grandmother's 78s in the estate sale, and he bought them. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So another label I want to bring up that I loved as a kid is the London label. Now the Stones recorded on this one famously, and I didn't actually have the record. My buddy Dan had Honky Tonk Woman. So that was a favorite of ours. And that's one A-side we did listen to, but I always had an affection for this beautiful, these blue colors here on the London label. Got another one for me, Ethan?
Yeah, and kind of sticking on that Stones theme, when it comes to the 45s, I don't just love the labels. I love the company sleeves.
Oh yeah.
And I think the best company sleeve in the UK were the 𝗘𝘁𝗰𝗰𝘀𝗁 sleeves. And I don't know, there's just something really mesmerizing about it. And what I've always loved about the British, they seem so fancy and proper with their, serif type and their, small, lots of writing. Or for the people watching, this is Shades of Orange by the end. So there's a Stones connection.
Yeah, that little sleeve there, if you want to hold that up again. Yeah, that sleeve with that graphic, that kind of blue swirl around there. That's a style of art that was somewhat popular in the late 50s. You'll see it in a lot of films, like Saul Bass was the guy.
It is very Saul Bass. 𝗘𝘁𝗃 carried this over until, even after the psychedelic boom was over, and they carried it over between their own labels. So the DRAM stuff launched in '66, carried over the same design, but just swapping out the logo. And this one is I Can Hear the Grass Grow by The Move.
Oh, that's a great label too. That
Oh,
Darum logo
I
you just threw
love
up.
I love the DRAM label.
Yeah,
It
that one
it feels
it's
very 2001: A Space Odyssey in a
and
way.
it's very clean. So the British labels are clean like that and very clinical. Or they started getting a little bit psychedelic, but they're much more clinical looking than the American albums
I
or the
think
American 45s.
that's what I think has always drawn me to the British ones, because they have their own centers attached, and
Yeah.
they're all prim and proper with lots of microtype and in serif fonts.
Now you're in from Canada,
Yeah,
and the 45s up there in the 60s. Did they have that little disc in the middle that was already connected or not?
I have come across a few
Okay.
that had them, but for the most part, no.
Because in America we didn't for
Yeah.
whatever reason. I
When
mean,
I
I
when I think of American 45s, I think of kind of really jumbled mishmash typesetting.
mhm. Yeah, some are worse than others. That's for sure. Let me pull out one that's kind of a clean American design that I've always liked, and that is Verve Forecast. So Verve was, I think Joan Baez was on here. This is like a folk label,
Yeah.
and with the muted colors here, it resembles the type of music that it plays. It's not trying to be too loud. It's just kind of folksy, I guess, and earthy. I'm going to pull out my favorite label of all time right now, since we're doing 60s 45s.
Okay.
And I probably heard my first Beatles single when I was it might have been at 4 years old. And this was my buddy Dan again, who had 3. And these are the actual ones he had. So Dan, I still have your 45s here, but we had the old Apple label. So the Apple label, to me, when I saw this was the first. What made this so different, it was a photograph. It wasn't a graphic. And then you had 2 completely different sides, the cut apple and the whole apple. I thought that was the coolest thing, even as a little kid. So I didn't even know who the Beatles were. This has come together in something. And then once I was able to read, I'm like, oh, this is the same band. And the other 45 Dan had was the old black VJ. This is Thank You Girl and Do You Want to Know a Secret? It's about as plain as you can get. It doesn't get any cheaper than this. But I was surprised to find out that all these songs I like, these were different labels by the same band. So that was, for a little kid, that was kind of a neat discovery.
We were talking about how the labels were getting kind of more out there as the
Mhm.
music was getting more out there. And I think this is a really good example of that, like hybrid between prim and proper British labels and full out psychedelic outrageousness. This is a Music Factory. It was an MGM label.
Oh, really? Was that British?
Yeah, it's British, and it's got it is very 1968 when all
Wow.
the labels were trying to start their own progressive labels.
Yeah, exactly. And in America, you didn't have that as much here. It seemed like it was more in Britain. They were doing more private labels like that.
Yeah, everything it seemed in America was just on one of the big ones.
Yeah, all the small ones like Verve or Elektra, those more folk style, they were starting to go big time because rock started taking off. They started signing rock bands and things. So,
And another one is it's a little less outrageous, but I have to mention this label because it is the label that probably holds the dearest spot in my heart, and that's Immediate Records.
oh, really? Yeah, I almost pulled that one out. I like that one too.
Yeah, it's
And that,
in my college admission portfolio, I actually did a font based on the Immediate Records logo.
so that immediate logo, that would have been a hand-drawn logo, and now people make fonts out of old stuff like that, and you can type anything with that font now. Really, it's pretty cool. Yeah, that was always a favorite one because I think that was also, they were always black on white, also very plain. And that was that Andrew Loog Oldham that started that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although towards the end, they went from white to pink.
Oh, did they?
Which looks a little less classy,
Okay.
but it's still nice.
Okay. I'm surprised Oldham didn't start with the pink. That would be more his style, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you'd think.
You think. Well, I'm going to show you another favorite of mine here that I grew up with, and it's the Capital Swirl. Now, I didn't have any Beatles Capital Swirls at the time. I had one Beach Boys. I had Barbara Ann, and I had Glenn Campbell's Wichita Lineman. But I loved watching the spin around on the turntable and getting dizzy from watching that.
Yeah.
So I think that was why they designed it. But I always loved that label. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Which one is that you're holding up?
This one didn't come out on Capitol in the States, but this is Thank You Very Much by the Scaffold.
Oh, wow.
Mike McCartney's group. And
wow.
I brought this one out because I really love this particular Capitol sleeve. It's ever since starting design school, I've become even more of a font snob than I already was. And I've just fallen in love with basic. If this wasn't Helvetica, it would surprise me.
Yes.
But it's just so clean and classy looking. I adore it.
Yeah, I've got the Helvetica. It's just one that doesn't go out of style.
Yeah,
and one of those classic
like the
fonts.
New York subway font.
Right. Some fonts are horribly out of style, and maybe bringing up some of those, but some are just period, and some are just look out of place outside of that period, and they look gaudy. Or
speaking of gaudy and looking out of place, this is one of my favorites, but it looks quite gaudy. It's the late 60s United Artists label.
But yeah, good colors on those. As a kid, I oftentimes was gravitating to the more colorful labels. And sometimes I would buy a record to use 45 just because of the label. I would have no idea what the music on it was, but I liked the
And
label.
I also really like the kind of simplified UA logo.
Yeah.
It's very 1969. 68.
And that's still very a classy design too.
Yeah.
As opposed to, well, I wouldn't say this isn't classy, but this is a Southwest FOB.
Oh wow, that is
label.
Out of all of the 45 labels I've ever seen, that is one of them.
This is one I got more recently, but I found it. I thought, I got it. I love this song, "Smell of Incense," one of the psychedelic singles that kind of hover around the middle of the charts. And this label is just, totally 1968. All right. Well, one of the things that everything we've been looking at, the 60s stuff, I'm going to show one label I don't like. And then one I've never liked is Atlantic.
Oh, I don't like that.
I've never liked this. I thought it's clunky. The colors are bad. The logo is okay. And I thought with such cool artists, they just the label just didn't match.
And the LP labels for Atlantic were quite nice, in my opinion.
Let's see. Was it the same? Was it the same thing as this?
No.
Or I'm trying to take a picture of how it was. Oh yeah, it was because the Rascals.
The green, white, and orange.
Yeah, the Rascals albums have that. That's actually pretty cool. And I wish that was on the 45. I thought it would look much better.
Yeah. See, I was thinking more like Zeppelin.
Ah, yeah. Well, speaking of Zeppelin, as the 60s turned into the 70s, the record labels went to another huge level. So Zeppelin's own personal label, Swan Song, you got these elaborate illustrations. So that was one that was Swan Song. And then you had like a gaudy label like Casablanca with some of the disco bands.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Which I'd never liked. Yes. And then you had the Warner Brothers move to this kind of like, this outdoorsy scene.
Yeah.
Trees.
Trees.
Yeah. That was, and then Asylum also had kind of a busy label. And all these, to me, I just didn't like any of them. They just were too busy, and they were just they're trying to use that as an artistic statement that didn't need to be busy. I mean, the Beatles already did that with Apple, and everybody tried to do their own Apple, I guess.
Well, Elektra got quite gaudy in mid-70s, but they kind of changed course and went back to a much simpler design.
Well, the Elektra label, and by the time the Cars were recording, I hated that label. it was like black and red. It looked very, it was
Yeah.
trying to, it was trying to look 80s in like 1979 or whatever it was. And I thought it was just, the old Electra label. I've got an old 45 here. Let me pull it out real quick. The old Electra look with the Doors were on, that mid 60s, they were still more of a, I think they were somewhat of a folk label. The Doors may have been the second rock band they signed after Love. I think Love was the first. So I thought this was a very cool 60s label. And then when they really kind of went off the rails and tried to be very modern looking, I didn't think it worked very well.
There's only one, I'll call it a style of 45 label that I can't stand, kind of sticking with the British ones. As the 60s turned into the 70s, turned into the 80s, some of the companies got kind of cheap and would use the injection molded labels. So it's just like silver,
Yes.
and then the type, and it's awful.
Yeah, those don't look good either.
It's like all the creativity once had died.
Yeah. Another label as big as it is that I couldn't stand was in the 70s. I don't like the Orange Capital label at all. And going from the Beatles, the Rainbow Capital was, I liked that. It was very cool, but I could see them making a change and updating it. It needed an update.
Well, I was fine with the update, and this
update, that one, yeah,
I much preferred.
See, that looks still very much 60s design, the bullseye.
Yeah.
And that is actually very cool. It's very, in the colors they chose, there's also a red version of that too, isn't there?
There is.
Red and purple. So they chose some very vibrant colors. And the Orange Capital label in the 70s with that also is a Helvetica font. It's getting a little bit too upscaley, I think.
Yeah.
Everybody, that's the word for it. The 70s labels were getting too upscaley looking. Yeah. And they lost a little bit of the mom and pop look.
Well, I'm not a big fan of the purple Capital label either, but it's preferable.
And then it went green for a while in the 80s, I think.
For the budget reissues.
Oh, was that it? Okay. Well, let's change gears here a little bit. Now that we talked labels, I want to talk a little bit about band logos, because in the 60s, that was a new thing.
Yeah.
And not everybody had a logo. By the 70s, everybody had a logo.
Yeah.
So the first band that had a logo, I guess, the one thing, let's just start with the Beatles, because they tried to have a logo, and they did have that, the Beatle antenna, that antenna, I think Paul McCartney designed. And that was around briefly until maybe when they came to the States and Ludwig Drums outfitted Ringo with a new set, and they came up with the Drop T logo.
They'd had the Drop T since I think I want to say like April of '63.
Okay.
They were using the Drop T drum head, but the antennae little bug Beatle logo stayed around in promotional stuff for the rest of the year. And I think it was France that logo hung on for a couple more years.
Okay.
Into 64 and 65 on some of the EPs and albums.
Okay. Yeah, the antenna one I think that's pretty cool. But the Drop T, I mean, the Beatles, that doesn't work very well in the psychedelic years, but boy, it is classy.
Yeah. Well, the Beatles did have a psychedelic drum head, but it was illegible.
The All You Need Is Love one?
Yeah, just the red and the yellow paint and the
I wonder who did that.
It was probably Ringo.
Yeah, maybe. Or Ringo's kid, one of his kids.
Yeah. It was almost definitely not the Fool.
Not the Fool.
No, they were too artsy.
Boy, did they got a lot of work out of the Beatles. Man.
Yes.
So another great logo of the 60s, one of the early bands to have a logo, were the Doors. I don't know who designed that, but it probably was an Elektra staff, because if you notice the Elektra logo,
it has that same kind of,
it is it's similar to the Doors thick outline of the letters,
which also kind of reminds me of Motown.
Yeah, it does. So I assume that maybe it was an Elektra designer. So I just think they had, if you look at the Elektra albums, the designs of those albums, they took much more care than for sure Capitol. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, the Doors logo, I mean, I think they pretty much used that throughout their whole career. Not in every album, but darn near. LA
Well,
Woman didn't use it, I don't think.
a band that did use their logo, actually label mates of the Doors, Love, had that same
Yes.
logo, I think, for all of the albums.
Yes, they did.
And
And Love was another Elektra from the Elektra stable. So I assume that they just had a design department there that cared about that kind of thing and really marketed it well and did something that was out, at that time, the psychedelic and just having your own logo was newer, as opposed to having something very clean cut on the front of an album, very block letter like.
Mhm.
Best of albums would be a good example of that. These were starting to get a little more artistic.
Well, that's actually one thing that I will give the 60s a big pass on. And I know we're talking about logos, but I think a great thing is almost the lack of standardized logos for the bands. See, I'm a big fan of the hand drawn, wavy psychedelic
Mm-hmm.
lettering,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt that being confined to a logo is a little bit restrictive. And we'll be talking about album covers in a bit, and I think the draw it as needed approach kind of worked a little better for some of these bands in the era.
Yeah, especially depending. One thing that comes to mind would be like Crimson and Clover. That album cover, they drew it to the photograph, and you can do different things with it. That whole psychedelic art
Yeah.
that came out of the West Coast, San Francisco in particular, really took hold worldwide. And
Moby Grape.
that's another one. I was the next one on my list. Moby Grape on their very first album, which is '67, had their own logo, and it's a psychedelic logo, but it's not illegible. It's pretty. It's a pretty nice logo. Actually, it's a very nice logo, very intricately done, hand done. I don't know who did that either, but they recorded on Columbia, so I'm not sure if they had kind of a goofy manager. Maybe he hired an art department to do that, but I don't know. But that's a great logo. In fact, I remember buying my first Moby Grape album and really recognizing that logo. So, wow, that looks cool. That was on their about their second album first, which is called Wow.
Again, I'll kind of add on to what you're saying. Label mates of Moby Grapes, the Byrds.
Yes. Another great album. So that album or the logo that was used on the third album, Fifth Dimension, which was very early. That's probably could be the first psychedelic rock album.
Yeah.
That one, I'm not sure when Donovan's Sunshine Superman came out, maybe a month later.
Yeah.
But
I should have grabbed that one.
Yeah, that's another one. There's so many I could grab.
Yeah.
But that Byrds album, that Byrds logo was only used for that album and the following album. And then they went away from it. But
wasn't it on the greatest hit?
No, it was not. In fact, I should bring that one out because I wanted to. Columbia, that's on the Columbia label. They're another one for being cheapskates when it comes to design. And Columbia, they would kind of utilize the same design for different bands, which I thought was really cheesy.
Peanut Butter Conspiracy.
Oh yeah.
I think they even did the United States of America.
Yeah, Peanut Butter Conspiracy, the second album, which is called The Peanut Butter Conspiracy is Spreading. Is that right?
That's
their second album?
That's one of the great album titles.
Yeah. So that album cover is identical in design to the Byrds' Greatest Hits, which came out just 4 or 5 months before it. They used the same design, and I just cry foul on that one. I mean, that's not being very creative. And Columbia really didn't do justice to their bands. So Columbia, you had Simon and Garfunkel, you had Dylan. So you had black and white photos on the back always, no color photos. The listing of the songs were always identical from band to band, not very informative. questionable liner notes. So yeah, I never liked Columbia's treatment at all.
Hell, CBS in the UK weren't any better. One of the great album covers, 𝗘𝘁𝗍𝗰 and Oracle, only existed because they made the band do the cover themselves.
Yeah, they hired a friend of theirs to do that.
𝗘𝘁𝗀𝗀𝗀.
𝗘𝘁𝗀𝗀, who misspelled the word Odyssey.
Yeah, and so they had to say, yeah, that was part of the plan all along.
Yeah, when you hire your friend, there's no proofing department.
Yeah,
Really.
it's like an O.
It's an O, exactly. So yeah, that's a great album cover, and you really did get some interesting album artwork. We're jumping the route here a little bit. We'll get to that, more of that in a sec. Let me get to a couple of other logos here. One of the ones I noticed right away that I loved, and I remember as a kid or as a teenager when I started doing like commercial art and design, because I loved dealing with lettering. That was kind of my thing. So the 60s poster art, I loved it. And the Monkees logo was one I thought I was very impressed with, having that guitar, the Monkees in the shape of a guitar. So that was a favorite of mine. I don't like it as much anymore just because I've seen it so much, but I copied it so much. So that's probably the reason I don't like it as much, but that's a very creative logo.
I'm trying to think of bands in the UK that had.
Yeah, UK, they were like, yeah, I don't think they did. I mean, the Stones didn't have a logo until
they didn't have a logo until the
70, 71, whenever that was. I mean, the biggest bands in England, if you go to the Who.
The Move had a logo.
Did they?
They and it was used almost consistently from their first, promo stuff to the end of the band. They used the same, kind of curly balloon-like.
Oh yes, lettering. Yep, kind of bubbly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the Who, they had a logo.
Yes.
But I get confused. The reissues utilize that mod look a little bit too. I mean, they always use it. I wasn't sure what was original and what wasn't. But I think that they, on the first couple albums, I think that the Who with the arrow, I think that's from some very early albums, I believe. I don't have their original albums.
I don't think it's on any of the. I actually don't think it's on any of the albums, strangely enough. For such an iconic logo, it wasn't used on My Generation. It wasn't used on The Quick One. Wasn't used on Sellout.
Yeah, you're right. I get confused. I get the American versions mixed up with the British. So
no, I don't think they used them on the American ones either.
No, I don't think they did.
But there is some great hand-drawn lettering on Magic Bus.
Magic Bus, yeah, that's a very good psychedelic album cover for sure. Well, another band I love. Oh, here's a band in England that had a logo, the Yardbirds.
The Yardbirds.
They had and that was on their very first album, Five Live Yardbirds.
Yeah.
So maybe I think they were being managed by Giorgio 𝗘𝘁𝗵𝗃 as well. So maybe 𝗘𝘁𝗃 just had a flair for something more artistic, and maybe he hired somebody to come up with that. I don't know, but I'm assuming that may be the case because they used that.
They used it right up into Little Games.
Yeah, they did. They did. And that's a great logo, and it fits them really well.
This is a Canadian best of from '67 featuring that logo.
I've never seen that cover.
It's gorgeous. I love it.
And now they in Canada, they were on Capitol. Is that right?
Yes, this was on the Capitol 6000 series.
Let's have a look at the back.
It's a little bit to be desired.
Okay.
But it's a record that starts with happenings 10 years time ago.
Well, you can't go wrong then.
You can't go wrong.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, let's go into the album designs a little bit. We've already talked a lot about some of the psychedelic album covers. And I think that started taking hold in about 66. And by 67, it was like even group bands like Herb Alpert or non-psychedelic bands started utilizing the psychedelic style in their in their design, which I thought was really cool. So you could always tell what was basically
Well, it
what
could be
year
seen as
came from.
cool, or it could be seen as co-opting
Yeah, or
a
trying to be
scene,
something that you're
cashing
not.
in.
Right, cashing in. So yeah, I think let me think what would be a cash-in album cover. Well, like the Supremes Reflections would be a one. That was in 1967. So that's they started getting more flowery. Even Motown started adopting that psychedelic look.
Um, Herman's Hermits, they had that album Blaze,
Blaze, yeah.
which kind of had that Piper at the Gates of Dawn
It did.
kaleidoscope cover.
It did. Yeah, yeah, it did. Yeah, everybody was getting into the act, no matter how unpsychedelic their music was. Yeah, one of the things that I always loved about purchasing albums is that you could tell an album, you could judge an album by its cover in the psychedelic era, or so I thought. I got burned on a couple of songs. I thought, oh, this should be great, but it wasn't very good. So I got burned a few times.
I'll
Go
be
ahead.
honest, ladies and gentlemen, I went a little overboard
Well,
pulling
that's all
out
right.
records to show.
We'll pull out a couple more since we're on the psychedelic topic here of
Okay.
album covers.
In terms of psychedelic album covers, I've kind of come to the conclusion that there are three categories. There's the illustration, there's the collage, and then there's the portrait. And hey, what's wrong with the camera here?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start with the collage section. You have,
Yes,
one of the greats,
Disraeli Gears.
original British pressing. And I've seen this album tons of times in stores, but it wasn't until I got this original one. It looks neon, and I swear to God it glows in the dark.
Really?
It is so bright.
Yeah, that's a very psychedelic cover. And the back is even, what does the back on that one look like?
It has another one of the great psychedelic traits, a random eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
There's got to be symbolism there, which is escaping me.
Yeah, could be. That's whole swing in London scene. It just went crazy psychedelic in 67. And by like spring of 68, it was pretty much over.
Yeah.
But yeah,
that news, the fact that it was over kind of missed some people.
Well, some people hung on a little longer. The album deals got done later and they didn't come out until 69. And yeah, it's especially in England, stuff lagged behind quite a bit. Record deals got done very slowly, I think, because you had
a good example of that is the band Tomorrow.
Yeah.
They had My White Bicycle in mid 67, and their album didn't come out until like March of 68. Yeah. By that time, all the hype had died.
Or 𝗖𝗵𝗲𝗀 by the Pretty Things, I think, came out later in 68. Not sure when, maybe even October. But yeah, that took a long time too. And by then the psychedelic phase was a fad. And
I'm sorry, you mentioned 𝗖𝗵𝗲𝗀.
Yeah, let's see what you got. Yeah, the fad died out. The psychedelic fad lasted about as long as the folk rock fad, which is about 18 months. And then that morphed musically into the prog rock genre and blues rock, and it just went in every direction after Sgt. Pepper. Ah, yes.
Just as we were talking about 𝗖𝗵𝗲𝗀.
Now the American version. Have you seen the American version of that album?
The tombstone.
Yeah, it's got an arched top.
Yeah.
And
how would that work in the cutout bins?
Yeah, it's already a cutout.
Yeah.
Same thing with Ogden's Not Gone Flake by the Small Faces, which is a completely round cover. And the version I bought in the 80s, which was a reissue, just had it square covered. It just had white filled in where those spaces would have been. But that would have been a hard record to keep in the sleeve, I would think. Yeah, that 𝗖𝗵𝗲𝗀, that's a great psychedelic album, one of the great British psych albums of all time.
This isn't terribly psychedelic, but I think it fits the criteria.
Definitely.
Gorgeous cover.
So that came out, I believe, in March of 67. Well, maybe a little bit later than March. Could have been April or May. But the artwork on there is all graphic. It's all graphic and hand-drawn.
There's a lot of Art Nouveau in a lot of these covers.
And the Art Nouveau was a big component of the San Francisco style of psychedelic art, poster art at the time. They drew a lot on the Art Nouveau as kind of a foundation to build the psychedelic lettering on top of. And that's an example of that.
Kind of Art Nouveau. This is the American version because I didn't want to grab the white gloves and go grab the British version. The Birthday Party by the Idle Race.
Oh, wow. I've never seen that.
Which is, it's the normal photograph, but they superimposed them on a paisley background and did some weird cutout stuff for some reason. Because Liberty Records was like, you know what? Let's take this great cover. Let's just fuck with it.
Well, was it an original cover, or they just had maybe a black and white photo to work with, or who knows?
Well, the photos in color on the original.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah. And this looks like a bad black and white scan.
So that's an American version?
This is the American version.
Okay, got it.
And kind of a little less classy. Time out, time in for them.
Yes.
Which it follows the trope of the cutout heads floating in something.
Yeah.
Started, I think, by this album.
Yeah, exactly. The Floating Head album. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe the Beatles started that with the Beatles, or Meet the Beatles back in '63 with the Floating Heads.
That's true. But Meet the Beatles was not nearly as day-glow as Little Games.
No, quite the opposite.
No.
Now the other one, if you can show that other one again, if you would.
This?
Yeah, them. That's a really good album, actually.
Oh, it is. It's. I may get crucified for saying this, but I actually like this album more than I like any of the Van Morrison stuff with them.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. That's a video I'll have to do, is to sort out the story of them. That's because in America, we had a couple hits, and they sold a couple albums, but
Gloria, Here Comes the Night.
Yeah, and they famously did some LA shows in late '66, early '67, I think, and I think with the Doors, and Jim Morrison joined Van Morrison on stage, which would have been great. Can you imagine seeing that?
Yeah. But then it got weird because them kind of split into two groups.
Mm-hmm.
Because two of the original members decided they wanted to be them, and they put out an album as like Belfast Gypsies, I think.
Yep, that's correct.
And then the rest of them, sans Van Morrison, I think relocated to America, and they had some albums written for them and produced on Tower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in all the bands, how they changed so much into the psychedelic era. If you listen to like Wild Thing by the Troggs in '66,
yeah,
and then hear some of their 1968 or '69 stuff, some really weird stuff.
It's a tragedy that some of the really psychedelic Trog stuff isn't easy to find.
Oh, it's impossible.
I think I'm trying to remember the name of the album. I think it was Mixed Bag.
Mixed Bag, yeah.
There's some really gnarly psychedelic tracks on that, but you can't find it.
Yeah, the other album is called Cellophane, I believe.
Yeah,
Cellophane. And that was 68 and '69, those two albums, I think, right in there. And I've not been able, if I found it, they're over $100 a piece, maybe even 200 now, but I have the songs. I got those on a couple of very good compilations on CD that came out, some box stuff that came out in the '90s. So I've got the songs, but I don't have the original albums. But the Trogs are one of those bands that actually, they traveled into psychedelia pretty well. You wouldn't think that, but they did all right. Not everybody was able to make the stretch.
Switch to another pile to see if I could find any groups that match that criteria, and I did.
The Hollies.
The Hollies.
That one is, so that's an example of a distorted photograph, and then they have the logo in the front of, well, the name of the album, and that was designed by the Fool.
Yeah.
The Beatles' pet design group from I think they're from Holland.
what I think is going on is the band, there's like a sheet of cellophane and Tony Hicks is poking it, but they overlaid
like cobwebby
it's
something.
very paisley.
Yeah.
But then the back cover is also quite psychedelic.
Yeah. Yeah. The Fool didn't spend a lot of time on that one, I can tell.
No.
But it's kind of cool that it's there because I think Graham Nash produced their album, didn't he? The Fool
so.
had an album, and Nash may have produced it, I think.
Oh, another example of a band that wasn't really psychedelic, but made a very bold attempt to try and make it that way, to Mixed Reception.
Yes. And that's with the lenticular cover.
Let me take it out of the plastic
For
sleeve.
Satanic Majesty's Requests. Yeah.
I love this album.
I can see why it got.
And anyone who says it's a copy of Pepper is mistaken.
Yeah, because it would be better if it was a copy of Pepper, wouldn't it? No, I think it's got some really strong stuff on it. I think it's got some very weak stuff as well, but overall, I mean, everybody was doing their psychedelic thing, and the Stones really, shouldn't have been any different. And they were already doing a little psychedelic stuff. If you take Ruby Tuesday, that's a perfect example of where the whole of 1967 was going musically.
Well, and the album preceding featured, a fairly trippy cover. It's one of the good old photography tricks of rubbing Vaseline on the lens or something.
Yeah, and that's a good point where it's a trippy cover done solely with photography. Yeah. Nothing more. A little bit of illustration on the bottom right there with Charlie's buttons, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah. What else you got? Oh, Traffic.
This album is this album means a lot to me. Yeah, it's just a great cover. It took me a while to figure out that I don't think that guy's in the band.
No, it's just, I don't even know what that in the inside. I think it's like some kind of somebody dressed up in some weird costume. I don't know what's going on there.
But you got Stevie Winwood, you have Dave Mason.
Oh, by the way, they have a logo as well. That logo in the upper right. And they have that graphic, that little arrow thing as well, that spinning arrow.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. Yeah, I bought that album in the 80s, that had that cover, but that's not the original American cover. The American cover,
the American
came out, only has 3 guys in the band. Dave Mason had left.
Well, and the American version was kind of pardon my French, shit show, because they couldn't decide on an album title. Because the first pressings were called Heaven Is in Your Mind.
Okay.
And then they changed it to Mr. Fantasy.
Probably a good move.
Yeah. This album has always held a soft spot in my heart.
Well, that's one of the early bands I tried to get into because I was trying to get into psychedelic 60s, and I found some Status Quo stuff, and it reminds me of basically that they're the early version of Spinal Tap, in their 60s,
Yeah, listen. I think this one has Listen to the Flower People on it.
Exactly. I think that, the B-side would have been Black Veils of Melancholy.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a funny band, very quirky, but some good stuff.
Cups and Cakes. Cups and Cakes.
But I have to say that Pictures of Matchstick Men, that song still holds up pretty well for me.
A lot of
I still turn it up.
Holds up.
Yeah, there's some good songs on there.
Ice in the Sun.
Ice in the Sun. Technicolor Dreams.
Although I will admit, half of the album is pretty much the same song, just with slightly rewritten. Yeah,
they weren't known for their guitar playing too much, were they? I mean, they were kind of the precursor to Def Leppard, maybe, but they didn't have. I suppose they got better.
I'm surprised I didn't read that in Mojo magazine.
What's
Status Quo, the Def Leppard of the 60s.
Yeah. There's one for you, Mojo. Well, let me change gears here a little bit, and we're going to take it back. Well, the concept of the girl cover probably went back really to the advent of albums in the 50s, 40s, really. And I'm going to pull out a couple here because I started buying girl covers, and Cheesecake covers is what they're called also. More recently in the last 15 years, because I could pick them up, I find them cheap, but there's some pretty pricey ones out there. This first one I'm going to show you. This one is behind Bridget Bardot. So it's a gatefold, and on the other side is the lovely Bardot. So whoopsie, this gatefold. So this one's a little bit pricier, but not too bad. So that's one of my
that's
favorites.
a cheap pun. Behind Bridget Bardot, right above her.
Yeah, that is a cheap one. I must say, here's another Bridget Bardot. This is from a film soundtrack. Just pull it out here. United Artists. This is 𝗖𝗵𝗲𝗰𝗀𝗀 original motion picture soundtrack with his machine gun. Now that's kind of cool. That's all right.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty cool. Quite possibly the most famous girl cover of all time has got to be Whipped Cream and Other Delights by Herb Alpert.
As I like to call it, the Goodwill Special.
The Goodwill Special. Yeah, you could get these for $1 just about anywhere in any record shop or secondhand store in America. And after a while,
and Canada.
So after a while, what I started doing is just buying them all. I wanted to corner the market and drive the prices up. I was just going to buy them all if I could for $1, I've only got like 7 copies, but one of the copies was my dad's. And one thing I didn't know, and my grandfather bought it for him. My grandfather was extremely conservative, religious, and my grandpa took him to the record store on his birthday. My dad bought this album, and my grandfather kind of grinned. You kind of just took it, And I didn't know my dad still had the record, but he gave it to me, and it's still in shrink for those people who care.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's got to be worth at least
$2. Yeah,
two, maybe even 3.
Maybe 3. Well,
4 if it's signed by Herb Alpert.
So yeah, this is probably the ultimate girl cover of all time. This actually was, even for those of you who are fans of pop culture, will notice this album actually makes an appearance in a Charlie's Angels episode, but that's a topic for another video. Another thing, if you're a British psychedelic band fan, like the Hollies and the Yardbirds end up playing at the 𝗘𝗵𝗻𝗀 Festival in Italy. See if I can get over here. So the 𝗘𝗵𝗻𝗀 Festival happened every year, and they would do an album of some of the performers there. So I started collecting some of these albums. I think I've got 3 of them, but they went from I think maybe 1960 through the end of the decade, I believe. But it's kind of interesting that that festival had its own album. And of course, there's always a beautiful girl on the cover.
I think the Move did the 𝗘𝗵𝗻𝗀 Festival.
Could be. Did they really? Wow.
Might have. I could just be lying.
And then these are some of the albums I just pick up in the dollar bin. Who is this? Carl Stevens and his orchestra. Pretty cool cover, though.
High Society Twist.
Yes.
Eat Your Heart Out, Chubby Checker.
And then you get other ones like Latin A Go-Go. That term A Go-Go was a little bit overused, but you put a pretty girl on the cover and nobody's going to care. So I've got a fairly big collection. And if you go to eBay and type in 1960s Cheesecake cover, you're going to see a bunch that are going for well over $150 and $200 a piece of some rarer ones, I guess.
See, you could get one of those for the price of an SF Sorrow.
Yeah, pretty much. Here's one I just found that I like. Manhattan Latin by Dave Pike. So that's kind of a sharp cover. So is
it just me, or does it also look like it has the Vaseline on the lens glowy kind of thing?
I'm not sure if that does. It's hard to tell. The Vaseline for me always blurred things out. Yeah. So this is, the background is blurred, but maybe it's just the aperture the camera's set at. But yeah. I mean, some of the photography is so good on some of these album covers, and it's blown up to 12 by 12. So you had to have some really guys who knew how to light. So a lot of these early 60s album covers are really very professional, very artistically done by the photographers.
That one in particular, I'm just impressed by the lighting.
Yeah. I mean, for those people of you out here who are photographers, if you look at some of the earlier stuff in the 60s, even all throughout the 50s, it's got some fantastic photography.
something that sadly I think the pop world didn't really get a whole lot of.
No, I mean the photography in, like, for instance, like Dylan's album Blonde on Blonde, he chose a blurred photo of him, which I think is excellent, but that would have been very unusual for the time. Nobody really, I don't know if anybody complained about it, but they may have had to sell the label on that. Because I mean, that was something you didn't do. That was beyond the pale. You know, if it's soft focused and it's supposed to be sharp, that would be trash.
But he's Dylan. He's Dylan. He can do
Dylan.
whatever he wants.
Yeah. So, well, let's finish up on. I want to talk briefly on the Beatles on Capitol, and the Beatles were on Capitol in Canada as well. And I always thought the Capitol designs were crap. And I know that years later because I've seen all the competition, which in many cases is much better. And if you look at Beach Boys albums, Beatles albums, anybody who was on Capitol during that time, whether it's Dean Martin or whomever, the style on the covers is very similar. And they didn't deviate a lot. So their art department was not very sophisticated. And for example, let me just show you, it also extends to the 45, the picture sleeves. So you got these Beatle ones here.
They're the same with the big chunky font at the top, and then the.
Exactly. There's not, I mean, you have this is an interesting photograph. You typically didn't get a live shot of the Beatles, but well, actually the other side is this. Forgot about this side. So just a basic shot, not even really a pose shot, just maybe.
Oh, it's not even a nice photograph.
No, it's not a nice photograph at all.
Talk about lighting. It's just flash.
It's crap. And then they would just do these kind of cutouts, just some concert photos, just whatever they can grab.
And
again, the same font at the top.
You can even tell some of those photos are flipped.
Yeah, they're backwards.
Yeah, I mean, Lennon and
Paul McCartney's playing right-handed and Lennon's playing left-handed. You know, it's hilarious.
There could be some sort of Paul is dead thing in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. He died in 1964, actually.
Yeah.
So this is the first. Well, actually, this was used twice. So this was used for "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and for "I'm Happy Just to Dance with You." They used the same photo for different sleeves.
"Can't Buy Me Love."
Did they really?
The "Can't Buy Me Love" one is insanely rare, but it's identical to "I Want to Hold Your Hand," except they just changed the song titles.
And we all know the Capitol didn't want anything to do with the Beatles. And once they were forced to release their stuff, they didn't really give them much attention in terms of the art design on the 45s or the albums. There we got
that being said, I'll still take a picture sleeve to no picture sleeve.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the frustrating things with the British ones. Yeah. Everywhere else in Europe even had quite nice picture sleeves. But with Britain, they just decided, people love Parlophone. They want to read about Parlophone.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the sleeves I like to redo, and I redo them in the style it would have been done in that day, but not like this, Oh, here we go. "I Want to Hold Your Hand." A couple of them here. This one's a little bit better, Matchbox Slow Down, but not by a whole lot.
They're being adventurous by using Cooper.
Yes, the Cooper font, correct. Which was used, that was a nice beefy font. Now, I thought I had...
Which they used on Pet Sounds.
They used on Pet Sounds. Now, speaking of the Beach Boys, I had some Beach Boys 45s here. Oh, here they are. And the design is extremely similar. Chunky, like a Helvetica fonts on the top, photograph on the bottom.
Thin font.
Yeah. I Get Around, same thing. At least that's somewhat of a pose photo. Here we got Peter and Gordon. I mean, black and white's not even color.
Yeah.
So it's really too bad that the Beatles were stuck with Capitol in the States for art. And we know what they did with the albums. They chopped them all up.
Canada made out okay with Capitol because I think you even showed some of them in your Yardbirds video. the Over Under Sideways Down. There
Mhm.
was some pretty interesting cover designs coming out of Capital Canada. Like one, if you're able to flash it up on the screen, because I don't want to have to get out of my chair
Yeah,
again.
no problem.
I'll even send you the high quality version I have. Across Canada with the Dave Clark 5.
Oh, really?
It's a really interesting cover.
That's an album cover?
Yes.
I didn't know there was an album like that.
Well, they had an album in the States called Coast to Coast.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so they did the same thing, but instead of America, Canada.
Okay.
And I remember showing it to my friends saying, I don't think you guys understand how strange this really is. Like the Dave Clark 5 weren't Canadian.
Yeah.
Across Canada.
Across Canada.
And there's like a little outlined map of Canada behind them. It's like, well, that's Canada.
Yeah. And they recorded in America on Epic. Yep. And the Dave Clark 5 albums were a little bit more imaginative than Capitol, but not by much.
Yeah.
A little bit nicer photography in some cases. Like we were talking earlier about some of the Beatles Capitol albums. Obviously, the original concept of this album that the Beatles wanted to do was no wording on it at all. Now that would have been like an ultimate, but there was an example of a record label, no wording at all. They just wanted their photo.
I had heard they wanted it to go full bleed black and have the title.
I had read full bleed black, but no wording. And they said, no way, there's no way we're gonna let you do that. And this was their second album, and they weren't quite, I mean, they were huge, obviously, but.
And then of course the Stones did that in early '64.
Was that
no title?
Really? Was there no title on that one?
No title on the first two British Stones
albums. Okay. Yeah, and this one, I think they were suggesting is no name of the band on it either. That would have been one of the ultimate art statements of the decade. But as it stands, this is
they sadly didn't get to do that until Revolver.
Yeah, and a word I don't use too often.
Rubber
Soul. But the classic cover, Robert Freeman, I think, may have done this photograph. Yeah. No, 𝗘𝗁𝘀𝗰𝗀. I forget who did it.
It's one of them.
Oh, Robert Freeman. Actually, Capitol actually put the photo credit on the back, so I stand corrected. They did do something well. But yeah, but they gradually, where they weren't using a already British cover, like this is sepia tone photos. I thought this was just cheesy.
Yeah, I kind of like that collage.
I like it now, but it's not befitting the Beatles, I don't think. I mean, as far as even the title, the second album, which in America technically would have been the third album. Yeah, it would have been the third album.
I think that was more just of a power move by Capitol to try and shove VJ out of the market.
Which goes to show you where the priorities were, wasn't on the artist. And then we have, of course, something new, which was actually something very old. I mean, and this is Hard Day's Night songs, and just slamming it together.
Yeah, almost something borrowed.
And the backs of the albums leave a lot to be desired. And they always saw fit to advertise as many other albums as they could on Capitol's back covers, which I always thought was the ultimate in cheese.
Which by the time they got to Yesterday and Today, you had two lines.
Well, had they not put their foot down with Sgt. Pepper, the back of that album would have been, you probably would have Beach Boys albums.
The nice thing, this is a Canadian one, so they actually have the Canadian
they do
albums.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it for my Beatle Capitol stuff that I was going to show. They now that I'm a little older, there's times I do kind of redesign their 45 sleeves at times and just make them a little bit nicer, because I think the Beatles deserve class, So, but I mean, this is all great stuff, and we grew up with it, so it's fun to have.
Germany probably had the best picture sleeves. Germany or France?
You know, I kind of cherry pick somewhere. I'd like this one from this country and this one from
Yeah.
that country, and
The ones from the Netherlands are pretty nice too.
Mhm.
Basically, most of mainland Europe got nice sleeves on either Parlophone or Odeon.
Mhm. Probably smaller labels with art departments that weren't so overworked and could
Yeah.
put a little more time into some of that stuff, I suppose. But
Well,
I don't know.
even in the UK on like the major labels, they seem to put a lot more care into their covers. Like some of the early Decca ones are quite nice. The Stones albums, them, like classy photographs.
Yeah, the Stones album covers, I thought the photography was always top notch. I mean, they always had an interesting cover, and they had a good feel for that, and it
The
fit them.
the British version of uh High Tide and Green Grass, big hits with
Hmm.
the fisheye lens,
Yeah,
gorgeous. Although they did use that in the States on the picture sleeve for Have You Seen Your Mother Baby Standing in the Shadow?
yeah, that's right. Yep, that's some pretty cool stuff. And that's getting that fisheye lens is getting into that psychedelic, distorted
Yeah,
look and everything. So that worked out well.
yeah.
The ultimate capital thing I never really understood. How they were so controlling over the material and so flippant with the artwork was the cover of Yesterday and Today, the original Butcher cover. How they let that go. I mean, I did a video of that so people can look at that video for the history of that album cover. Out there you go.
This is Matt's version of
Oh,
Yesterday and Today.
that's one of the that's even more rare than the actual Butcher cover.
Yeah. How do I peel?
Yeah. You peel it off, the revolver covers underneath there.
Oh,
No.
you
But
heard it
yeah,
here first.
yeah. Yeah, so that was a very strange, for as cheap as Capital was. Well, I guess they didn't scrap the covers. Was they were supposed to? Apparently, they just pasted over a cover using the original anyway. But they probably really were torqued off by having to do that. Somebody's heads probably rolled, but I don't know
Yeah.
whose.
Then you have this.
The suitcase,
It's
the
grown
trunk,
on
the
me.
trunk cover. Yeah.
It's grown on me. I love the lettering.
Yes, that font is called, I forget the name of that font. Do you
I think
remember
it's
it?
Sigmund.
Sigmund. Yeah, you're right. It's Sigmund. That font was used on the back of Rubber Soul. So that was used on two consecutive Beatle albums.
Was it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's the only time they ever used it. But it was one of those kind of mid 60s fonts. It's almost like a pre psychedelic font.
Yeah.
And I always liked that a lot.
It's a little artsy.
Yeah.
Getting a little bit more ornate.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Well, that's all I had for you, Ethan. Let's close this up here. How should we close this up? Let me
Uh,
think. Um,
I can do a song and dance.
well, let's, I tell you what, well, I think we'll close it there because we could go on for another hour and bring out albums, but I think people get the idea of
Yeah.
some of the direction of the art back in the day, that, and an opportunity to talk outside of the music a little bit, and how the artistic album cover designs were growing along with the music. So I think that's important to talk about because, I
I'll
mean,
end it just by showing one last one.
yes, of course.
One of my
Ah,
favorites, Kaleidoscope,
the British kaleidoscope.
with the gorgeous, you know, lettering and the. I love the typesetting and the shape of a.
Shape
It's
of a
like a
pear,
pear.
maybe.
I think it's a
Yeah.
pear.
Yeah, that's another great example of that psychedelic
Yeah.
artwork that started adorning every album cover.
Although
And
it's not so subtly shades of Rubber Soul.
right, right. So we'll have to do this again. We'll have to do there's all kinds of different album covers we can look at. Great ones, bad ones, you know, all kinds of trippy ones and goofy ones.
Yeah.
And it got interesting as the decade went on, as the fashion changed. And then You know,
I
the
think
70s
I
were
think I
interesting as
called out
well.
enough albums that we can do another, 10, maybe 12 parts.
And I didn't pull out half of mine yet. So yeah, we'll do that. So let me just ask people watching this, put down some of your favorite album covers that you like. Any of you designers out there, let us know what you felt was strong or weak in some of the design of the time, and we'll have a look at those comments. So thank you for watching. And Ethan, make sure to check out Ethan's, I'll leave a link below to his podcast. He's available in several different places where podcasts are found.
Pretty much anywhere you may want to listen to your podcast.
Well, Ethan, thank you for joining me here. And we will be back here talking about more art and more labels and more design here on Pop Goes the 60s.